Hi. So a while back I made a video on how to create a 3D stylized axe for games. I tried to make it really quick and punchy. However, in doing so I sort of, breezed over some important details. So in this video I'm going to create this 3D zap gun following a similar workflow, but I'm going to go a bit more in depth into how to make it, a bit more better. A bit more better? I can speak. So here's the concept that I used. I did not create it. I found it online and I really liked it, so I reached out to the creator to see if I could use it, and he's given me permission. So big shout out to Sharon TS. Thank you for allowing me to use it. So you should all go check out his page and make sure you give him a like and a follow and all the other things that social media people do these days. I don't know. Alright, so just doing some standard modeling stuff. For this video I'll try and show as many steps as I can, so yeah, it's gonna be a long one. But I'll just show a time lapse and I'll chime in when I do something worth noting. So here I'm just creating a basic shape, and then on this shape I'm going to set it to make live, and then if I enable the quad draw tool, it means I can just draw polygons over the top of this mesh, and those polygons will stick to the mesh, so I can focus more on the topology and not have to worry about the shape. And again, it's good practice to try and use quad workflow as much as you can, but if you have to use a try every now and then, as long as your mesh is not going to deform around that section, it should be fine. After I create this curve, I'm going to use the sweep mesh tool, and you can essentially tubify it. Tubular dude! I'm also going to fix up the caps of the cylinder so that they don't all converge into one vertex. There's multiple ways to do this. However, this is the way I like to do it. Right, so I've finished the low poly. Now, essentially, it'll be ideal to keep all the objects separate because it will bake better. However, you don't need to do that. You can combine them down into less objects. You just have to make sure that each part of your mesh is not touching each other. So there's enough space between each different element. And I'm also going to make sure that at least one of the objects that I combine together is symmetrical. And I'll show you later why that's important. And I managed to condense mine down into just 4 objects. And I'm going to rename them so they have the underscore low at the end. I'm just going to scale it and also reposition it so the center of the grid is where I want the pivot point to be. And now if you hold D and then X, you can drag the pivot point to the center of the grid. And I'm going to make sure I do this for all the objects. And I'm going to make sure I delete history and freeze transforms. And now I'm going to make a duplicate of all those, and I'm going to rename them to smooth. And on each smooth version, I'm just going to go through and I'm going to add supporting edge loops so that when I smooth the mesh, it maintains its form. Sometimes the bevel won't work the best way, so I'm just going in here and fixing it up so it smooths a bit better. I'm also going to model in some higher details here. I just find it easier to do it in this stage rather than try and sculpt it in ZBrush. I want to indent this cylinder, so first I'm going to lock in some smoothing so it maintains the cylindrical form. And then I'm going to use the transform tool, which will actually push or pull in the edges based on the normal direction. And then I'll just lock in an extra level of smoothing. And I'll do the same thing for this top tube thing. Once I've finished, I'm just going to double check that all my pivot points for both the low and the smooth versions are the same. Now I'm going to export the smooth versions. So I could just select them all and export it as an FBX. However, if we bring that into ZBrush, what's going to happen is it's going to cause some symmetrical issues. And that's because ZBrush will center the mesh based on the bounds. And because this mesh is not symmetrical, it's not being put in the center. So what I actually prefer to do is to export each object as an OBJ. And then you can import in the object that is symmetrical. And therefore it'll come in centered in ZBrush. So then if you insert a new subtool and then import the second mesh, it's actually going to overwrite that subtool. But it's going to keep the initial centering of the first subtool. Therefore, symmetry is just going to work really nice for all subtools. So before I start sculpting, I'm just going to divide it once more. And then give it a high resolution Dynamesh. And to carve in this little line thingy, I'm going to use the chisel brush because I think it works pretty well. It works really well if you do the majority of your strokes in one move. So just don't take your hand off. And to fix up any little jaggies in the middle, I'm just going to run the smooth brush through the center. I'm going to use the trim dynamic brush just to, put some little chips around the outside. This model doesn't necessarily need that much sculpting, but I can't help myself. To put in some stylized cracks, I'm going to use the Orbs Cracks brush pack, which you can find on ArtStation. Here I'm just using the mask brush to paint in some sort of abstract shape. Then I'm going to use the inflate deformer to push it in a little bit. And same thing here with these dotties. And I'm going to use the insert multi-mesh brush to put in some of these screws. These are only surface level details, so I'm not going to worry about the actual geometry for these. But I'm going to make sure I split them as separate subtools after I've inserted them. And then I'll just merge all the screws down to one subtool. To make this side a little bit more interesting, I've just imported a custom alpha, and I'm going to use the mask brush and then inflate it and then give it a slight polish. Now at this point I'm finished, but our mesh is quite dense, so as you can see it's like 5 million polys. So I'm going to use the decimation master and reduce it down to 250,000 polys. And you can see here how it works. It basically keeps all the fine details, but it reduces density where it doesn't need those details. So I've decimated all the subtools, but on the screws, I'm just going to make sure they're the same poly group. So I'm just going to press Ctrl W, and then I'm going to merge it with the first subtool and just make sure that they keep their separate poly groups so that we can bake an ID map. I'm also going to rename them all so that they end in _high. Then I'm going to export it as an FBX, but I'm going to make sure that I tick export polygroups as mattes so that I can bake the ID map later. And just make sure the name has _high. And I'll import the high version into Maya, and I'll just make sure the low poly matches as closely as it can to the high version. And I'm just cutting in some more detail here just because it adds to the silhouette a lot better. I'm also going to go through and just delete any unnecessary polygons. So basically the ones that you don't see, the ones that are hidden. And just optimize a few areas as well to work better as a low poly mesh. Now when it comes to UVing, I like to select all the polygons and just create a new planar map because that'll remove all the seams and allow me to start fresh. Then I can select edges, then cut them as seams, select the entire element and then unfold it. And I just move them out of the way. In some cases I like to pick an area that I can straighten, and then if you select all the other vertices, you can unfold it, essentially pinning the ones that you didn't select, which sometimes gives a more desired result depending on how you like to texture. Sometimes I like to completely straighten out my UVs. This comes down to taste. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But in this case, I'm trying to get it as straight as I can, and then I can use the straighten UVs function and then just manually tweak it to fix it up. Sometimes you get these areas where you're like, what the hell do I do here? Just trial and error. I tried this, I liked how it unfolded, so I kept it. And sometimes an area won't unfold properly, so I just nudge a few vertices until I can select a polygon. Then I'll double click that polygon to select the entire element, and then when you unfold that, it should work. You can also select an edge, then use the Orient to Edges tool, and that will realign the entire shell to go straight based on that edge. And here's a situation which I could try and straighten out some areas. However, I'm not going to bother. I think it unwraps nice like this, so I'll just keep it. Alright, so I've finished unwrapping, and you can see that they're all over the place and they're also overlapping. So a quick way to pack them is to simply just select all the shells, then use the layout function. But as you can see, a lot of the shells are touching, and they're also touching the border. So you just need to open up the layout options and then add some tile and shell padding. I just choose 4, and then when you lay it out, it should keep a nice gap between all the shells and the border. Alright, so now all our hard edges, they look nice while it's in low poly form. However, it's going to cause issues when we bake. So first we just want to choose all the objects and then soften the edges. Then we can open up the soften hardened edges options, and we can tick texture borders and apply that. And that's basically going to harden all the edges of our UV seams, which will give us a more accurate bake. So you'll need to do this per object. So if you just select the next object and press G, that will repeat the last action. So you can just go through and do that. So just select it, press G, select it, press G. Then we can select all the objects, delete history, freeze transforms, and export it as an FBX. Just make sure you put _low at the end. Now just import your low mesh into Substance Painter and increase the resolution, and make sure you don't have auto unwrap ticked. Then click on bake, increase your resolution, and in the high definition meshes, just import the high version. Then I'll add some anti-aliasing. I'll also make sure it matches by mesh name. And you can see underneath that it's already primed to use _low and _high. For the ID map, I'm going to make sure the color source is set to mesh ID polygroup. And I also like to increase the secondary rays as high as they go. Then click bake and enjoy your cake. And because we kept space between each element in our mesh and we baked by mesh name, we should have minimal artifacts. You can also see that the screws that we used only as a normal map, they look fine, and it doesn't matter that they don't have their own geometry. So when I start texturing, I like to just chuck on a smart material, just as a base, see what it looks like, see where I can go from there. And I like the way this one looks, so I'm going to keep this applied, but I'm going to create my own color map for it. So I'm going to add a fill layer to a folder, then I'm going to add a black mask to the folder, then I'm going to choose the polyfill tool to choose the polygons where I want this color to show through. Then I'm going to add a dark color and use the mask editor just to get a nice sort of shading start to go from. And sometimes it's easier to change the viewport to show base color only so that you don't get influenced by the lighting. Now I want to hand paint some details, but I want to do this symmetrically. And as you can see, it's the same issue we had in Zbrush where the symmetry is not working correctly. So to fix this, I just enable wireframe so I can see the center, and then I adjust the symmetry settings, and I'll just nudge it until I get the symmetry as close to the middle as I can. Now I'm just going to hand paint some details to give it that sort of painterly stylized look. And for each different color that I add, I make sure it's a fill layer with a mask so that I can go through and edit the colors easier later if I need to. Then I'm going to use the mask editor with a brighter color just to define the edges. And I'm just putting a paint mod on top so that I can manually paint in some extra highlights. These paint mods are good because they're non-destructive. So if you don't like something, you can just turn it off, or you can reduce the intensity, that sort of stuff. And now just making a dark layer to reveal the cavities. And once I'm happy with the intensity, I can change the base color. So now I'm happy with my base color, so I can now copy that folder and paste it into the smart material just above the base, so that it will essentially replace that base color. Now I want to add some metal showing through underneath the paint, but I need to enable the metal channel on one of my color layers and then set that to 0 so the metal doesn't show through onto the paint. Then I'm just going to use the good old metal edgeware smart mask. Then I'm going to add a paint mod on top of that, and then I can just manually paint in or out areas where I don't think the mask did a good job. Now for the screws, we don't want to go in and manually paint a mask, so this is where the ID map comes in handy. So instead of adding a black mask, I can add a mask with color selection, and then I can use the color picker to choose the color where the screws are, and that's going to mask it by color ID. And I can just add a paint mod and then choose the regular polyfill tool to add the bigger screws. Now for the most part, I use the same technique. I'll just add a base color, then I'll add a darker color for some shading, then I'll add a lighter color to define the edges, then I'll probably add a darker color to define the cavities. But in this case, I'm also going to go in and do some manual painting. For this top area, I'm going to use the line stripes pattern as a mask. And because I aligned the UVs nice and straight, it means I can simply position it in 2D space and I shouldn't have any issues. And then I'm just going to, give it another hand touch. Hand touch? That doesn't sound right. You know what I mean? Hand touch. Alright, so I want to add some emission, so I'm going to enable the emission channel. And for the emission fill layer, I'm going to set both color and emission to the same color. Then just mask that with some cool pattern. And yeah, I decided to hand draw these. No. So in order to see the effect of the emission, you need to enable the post effects, and then you can adjust the glare settings. You may also need to increase the emissive intensity as well. So for these little light thingies on the side, it's not ideal to try and paint it in 3D. And if I try and paint it in 2D, it's going to paint over different tiles. So you want to change your brush alignment to paint on UV. And now it should only show up where you paint. Ping! Here I'm just experimenting with a glow filter, just to see if it's better, worse, I don't know. But once it's done, you want to export the textures. So I'm going to go to File, Export Textures, and I want this to work in Unity. So in the output template, I'm going to choose the Unity URP Metallic Standard, and also change it to 8-bit plus dithering. Then choose Export and open the output directory to get your textures. So before I put it in Unity, I'm going to combine all these shapes into one, and I'll have to fix up the pivot point again, then delete history and freeze transforms, and you can export as an FBX. Now in Unity, I'm just going to open up the 3D sample scene for the universal render pipeline and just hide all the objects I don't want. Then I'll import the FBX, and I'll create a new 3D cube. And then for the mesh filter, I'm going to choose the FBX that we imported. Now I'm going to drag in the textures and then create a new material. And just make sure that material is universal render pipeline. I'm going to apply that material to the mesh, and then drag all the textures into the right slots. However, when it comes to the normal map, you want to change the texture type to normal and then hit apply, and then it should work as expected. Now we can enable emission, then drag the emission map in there. Then if you click into color, you can increase the intensity. Now it's not gonna emit light dynamically, so we can just fake it by adding a light and then changing it to green, and it'll give, you know, a decent effect. And then on the post-process volume, you can just tweak the bloom settings until it looks good. Something. And that is vegan. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I hope it helps with something. But yeah, thank you. Bye.